Imagine a time when movie studios were so desperate for new ideas that they would literally fund anything. A time when the people in charge of deciding what was too inappropriate for audiences were still trying to figure out the rules themselves. That's exactly what happened in the 1970s. For about 10 years, there was this crazy window where filmmakers could make movies that were so raw, so honest, and so shocking that they would never get made today. We're talking about films that got banned in their own time and still feel too dangerous for modern audiences. These movies slipped through the chaos of that decade and became legendary for all the wrong reasons. Today, we're diving into 10 of the most controversial films from the 70s, movies so wild that even when Hollywood tries to remake them now, they can't come close to capturing how bold the originals were. Trust me, some of these stories are absolutely insane. Let's start with a film that literally went all the way to the Supreme Court. Carnal Knowledge came out and immediately triggered one of the biggest legal battles in movie history. This wasn't just some underground film that nobody watched. This was a major movie that almost got banned permanently and ended up changing the rules for every film that came after it. The story follows two college roommates named Jonathan and Sandy who spend decades chasing after women. But here's the thing. The movie doesn't make them look cool or charming. Instead, it shows them as emotionally broken men who have no idea how to actually connect with another person. Their relationships get more and more destructive as the years go by until both of them end up completely isolated and alone. The film basically stripped away all the glamorous lies about the sexual revolution and showed the emotional damage underneath. Anne-Margaret took a massive risk playing a character named Bobby who falls into suicidal depression because of her husband's emotional abuse. She was already a huge star, but she gave up all her glamour for this role to expose some really dark truths about how Hollywood treated women. In 1972, something crazy happened. A theater manager in Albany, Georgia got arrested just for showing this film, not for doing anything else, just for screening the movie in his theater. The Georgia Supreme Court actually said the arrest was okay. It took until June 1974 for the United States Supreme Court to finally step in and reverse the decision. That's a 3-year legal battle over whether people should be allowed to watch this movie. The case became super important because it created protection for future films to explore adult themes. But think about how scary that is. For 3 years, local authorities could just arrest you for showing a film they didn't like. The whole situation showed how easily people in power could use vague laws about obscenity to shut down art that made audiences think about their own behavior in uncomfortable ways. Now let's talk about Soldier Blue, a film that completely destroyed the myth that America was always the good guy in history. This movie showed the United States cavalry as brutal killers and created a connection to the Vietnam War that was so intense and disturbing that it actually ended some people's careers. The story follows a cavalry soldier named Hannes who survives an attack and has to travel across dangerous territory with a tough woman named Cresta. She keeps warning him about how cruel the military really is, but he doesn't believe her. Then they arrive at a village and he watches with his own eyes as his own army carries out a systematic massacre of innocent people. Now here's where it gets really disturbing. The director hired real amputees from Mexico City to play extras during the massacre scene. He used their actual physical conditions to create the illusion that soldiers were hacking off people's limbs in real time. He deliberately made the violence as traumatizing as possible instead of making it look cool or heroic like most war movies did. The film was a massive hit in Great Britain because audiences there understood it as a powerful criticism of American imperialism and the lies America told itself. But in the United States, it completely bombed. The U.S. Army was outraged. Conservative critics lost their minds. A real survivor of the Wounded Knee Massacre said watching the film was the most horrifying experience of his entire life. Several countries banned the movie completely. Why? Because it threatened the comforting story that America was always fighting for good and freedom. During the Vietnam War, when Americans were being told their soldiers were heroes, this film came along and said, wait a minute, maybe we need to look at our own history and see the pattern of violence we've been ignoring. That was too much for most people to handle. Then we have Apocalypse Now, which is legendary not just for what's on screen, but how insane the actual filming was. This movie weaponized the chaos of its own production to create a descent into madness so real that it nearly killed the lead actor. The line between acting and reality completely collapsed during this film. The story follows Captain Willard as he travels up a river into Cambodia with orders to find and kill Colonel Kurtz, a decorated officer who has gone completely insane and established his own cult deep in the jungle. Willard witnesses increasingly surreal and horrifying things until he finally confronts Kurtz in a temple surrounded by human skulls. The opening scene where Willard smashes a mirror and starts crying while covered in his own blood? That wasn't acting. Martin Sheen was heavily drunk during filming and actually cut his hand on the broken mirror. Instead of stopping, he insisted on continuing the scene while smearing his real blood all over everything. The director just kept the cameras rolling. Martin Sheen was only 36 years old when he had a massive heart attack in the middle of filming. He had to crawl a quarter of a mile through the jungle just to find help. He came so close to dying that a priest gave him last rites, which is basically the religious ceremony you get when you're about to die. Meanwhile, Marlon Brando showed up vastly overweight and hadn't even read the script, even though they were paying him $1 million per week. The director had no choice but to keep Brando mostly in shadows and darkness because of his weight, but this accident actually made the character of Kurtz even more mysterious and philosophical. The film became the definitive statement about the Vietnam War by suggesting that war doesn't drive men crazy. Instead, it just reveals the insanity that was always hiding inside them. Kurtz represents what happens when American imperial power is stripped away of all its moral justifications and stands naked in the jungle. Age of Consent became Helen Mirren's introduction to Hollywood controversy when the studio completely panicked over what they thought looked creepy. Even though Helen Mirren was 22 years old, the studio worried about a 60-year-old man being obsessed with what they kept calling a child in the film. This panic led to the director's vision being erased for 36 years. The story is about Bradley, a tired New York artist who escapes to a remote Australian island where he meets Cora, a wild local girl who becomes his artistic muse and model. Helen Mirren spent a lot of the film without clothes during swimming scenes and modeling sequences. But when the film left Australia and came to America, the studio sliced out nearly 10 minutes of footage to make conservative censors happy. For 3 entire decades, people could only watch the butchered version. Then, in 2005, Martin Scorsese found the original film negatives and restored all the banned scenes. Finally, people could see the serious character study that the studio had destroyed years before. The studio also hated the original musical score so much that they completely replaced it with a boring, generic orchestral soundtrack. This made the movie feel cheap and exploitative, instead of being a meditation on artistic freedom it was supposed to be. The scandal followed Helen Mirren for years. 6 years later, when she was working with the Royal Shakespeare Company as one of their leading actresses, a BBC host decided the best way to interview her about playing Lady Macbeth was to call her a sex queen and ask about her equipment. When she calmly asked him what he meant by equipment, he stammered and finally admitted he meant her body. Rather than getting embarrassed, Mirren composed herself and dismantled him on live television. She said she hoped that the performance and the connection between the actors and the audience would overcome such boring questions. The audience laughed at him, not her. It was a perfect example of how absurd and sexist the treatment of actresses was during that era. Scum became the film that the BBC banned before it even aired because it exposed the British juvenile detention system as a place that created more violent criminals instead of helping troubled kids get better. The story follows Carlin, a young offender who gets sent to a brutal detention center where survival depends on becoming the most violent enforcer. The facility is run through a hierarchy of extreme violence that leads to a gang assault and a suicide that eventually spark a massive bloody riot. The BBC's Director General banned the original 1977 television version because he was horrified by the graphic violence and feared the film would actually cause real prison riots. But director Alan Clark took the unprecedented step of refilming the entire thing as a theatrical movie that was even more violent than the TV version. The most shocking moment is when an inmate named Davis slowly takes his own life while the guards show complete indifference.
That scene led to questions being asked in British Parliament, with politicians accusing the filmmakers of polluting young minds.
But here's the twist. The film's impact on its tiny budget of £250,000 created such a huge public conversation about the barbaric conditions in these facilities that the British government actually abolished the entire Borstal detention system in 1982. A film that was banned for being too dangerous ended up forcing exactly the kind of change that authorities feared it would inspire. That's the power of honest storytelling. Stalker is one of the most haunting films on this list, not just because of what's in it, but because it literally killed the people who made it. The pursuit of spiritual truth in this film came at the cost of actual human lives. The story takes place in a mysterious zone where a room at the center supposedly grants people their deepest desires. Illegal guides called stalkers take people through this zone filled with shifting supernatural traps. One stalker takes a cynical writer and a skeptical scientist on a philosophical journey through decaying, abandoned terrain. The film was shot at 2 deserted hydroelectric plants in Estonia, where the water was heavily contaminated with chemical waste. The crew spent months in stagnant, poisonous conditions. Years later, the director, his wife, and the lead actor all died from the exact same rare form of cancer. The toxic location had killed them. After spending an entire year filming, the director returned to Moscow and discovered that over 6,000 feet of film negative had been improperly developed. He believed it was deliberate sabotage by Soviet officials who hated his obscure artistic style. He had to start over. The film became a meditation on faith in a godless world, with the zone functioning as a spiritual landscape where characters must face whether achieving their deepest desires would actually destroy them. It asked questions about human nature that Soviet authorities found genuinely dangerous because the film suggested that maybe life under communism wasn't worth living. The fact that people died making this film only adds to its tragic, haunting legacy. Straw Dogs was effectively banned in the United Kingdom for nearly 30 years because it dared to suggest that violence might be something humans are born with rather than something they learn. This idea terrified critics who saw the film as fascist propaganda. The story follows David, a mild-mannered American mathematician who moves to rural Cornwall with his wife Amy. But the harassment from local men keeps getting worse until Amy is brutally attacked. When a mentally disabled man takes shelter in their home, David's repressed rage finally explodes in shocking violence. The most controversial part of the film is a sequence showing the attack on Amy, where the director portrayed her response in an ambiguous way, suggesting that trauma and involuntary physical responses could happen at the same time. The director refused to provide moral clarity about what consent actually means, and that made people incredibly uncomfortable. When people tried to release the film on video in the 1980s, it was rejected under the Video Recordings Act for promoting harmful activity. It didn't get approved for release until 2002. The film became a test for whether audiences could separate showing violence from endorsing violence. Critics argued that the director's refusal to condemn his main character's savagery made the film itself an act of violence. Defenders said cinema has an obligation to explore the darkest parts of human nature without wrapping everything up in a nice moral lesson that makes people feel better. That debate is still going on today. The French Connection redefined what an anti-hero could be by making its main character a brutal cop whose violence is never condemned. Audiences were left celebrating someone who breaks every single rule to get results. The story follows Jimmy Popeye Doyle and Buddy Cloudy Rousseau, 2 narcotics detectives who discover a massive heroin smuggling operation from France. Doyle becomes increasingly obsessed, and his tactics blur the line between law enforcement and criminal behavior. The iconic car chase scene was filmed without permits in real New York traffic at speeds up to 90 miles per hour. Actual civilians had to dive out of the way, There was even a real crash that the production team just paid off on the spot and kept filming. Gene Hackman won an Academy Award for playing Doyle, who is based on a real detective known for brutality and casual racism. But Hackman was a liberal-minded actor who found the racist dialogue so disgusting that he repeatedly threatened to walk off set. The director deliberately provoked him into real anger to get the performance. The film arrived at the exact moment when Americans were losing faith in their institutions. Doyle represented a cop who gets results through methods that would be called criminal if anyone else did them. It created a moral void that modern Hollywood struggles with because today's audiences expect clear heroes and villains. The French Connection gave us neither, and that made it revolutionary. Finally, we have The Night Porter, which became the most controversial exploration of trauma bonding in cinema history. The film suggested that concentration camp survivors and their captors could share a twisted intimacy that went beyond simple ideas of good and evil. The story takes place in Vienna in 1957. Max is a quiet night porter at a hotel, hiding his past as an SS officer during World War II. His quiet life falls apart when Lucia, a survivor of the camp where he served, checks into the hotel. The two of them retreat into a locked apartment to reenact their wartime roles in deeply disturbing ways. While filming on location, actor Dirk Bogarde stepped into public wearing an SS uniform. Elderly Viennese people swarmed him, and some appeared genuinely nostalgic for the Nazi era. One woman actually fell to her knees to kiss his boots, while others started singing a forbidden Nazi anthem. This real-life encounter revealed that the film's exploration of lingering fascism wasn't made up. It was reflecting a hidden reality that polite society refused to talk about. Charlotte Rampling accepted the role just 4 months after giving birth and channeled her exhaustion into playing a woman spiritually destroyed by the camps. Her performance was so raw and disturbing that critics called the film Nazi chic. The movie asked a question that still makes people deeply uncomfortable. If someone survived through submission and formed a bond with their captor, could that bond become stronger than morality itself? What kind of compromises do people make to survive, and what does that mean about human nature? Decades later, audiences still struggle with this film because it refuses to provide easy answers. So there you have it. 10 films from the 1970s that were so controversial, so uncompromising, and so brutally honest that they could only exist in that brief window when studios were desperate and censors were confused. These films got banned, sparked legal battles, ended careers, and literally killed some of the people who made them. They explored the darkest parts of human nature without apologizing or wrapping everything in a comfortable moral lesson that makes people feel better. They showed violence, trauma, sexuality, and moral complexity in ways that made audiences genuinely uncomfortable. And that's exactly why they mattered. These films forced people to confront truths about war, authority, sexuality, survival, and violence that society wanted to ignore. They proved that cinema could be more than just entertainment. It could be a mirror held up to society's face, showing all the ugly parts we'd rather pretend don't exist. Could these films be made today? Honestly, probably not. Modern studios are terrified of controversy. Audiences expect clear heroes and villains. Social media can destroy a film's reputation before it even comes out. The 1970s was a unique moment in history when filmmakers could take massive risks, and some of those risks created masterpieces that we're still talking about 50 years later. Others created films that remain deeply problematic and uncomfortable, but all of them pushed boundaries and asked difficult questions that movies today are too scared to ask. If this deep dive into controversial cinema history fascinated you, do me a huge favor and smash that like button right now. These stories of banned films, Supreme Court cases, toxic filming locations, and real-life chaos deserve to be remembered and discussed. Share this video with anyone who loves film history or anyone who thinks modern movies play it too safe. And definitely subscribe to this channel, because we're always bringing you the untold stories, the controversial moments, and the shocking truths behind the movies you thought you knew. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we drop a new video exploring the wild side of cinema history. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one, where we'll dive even deeper into the films that changed everything.